I make games, and I make games well. What I don't do so well is talk to people who are going through an intense emotional experience. But that's exactly what I had to do in January of 2011. My aunt passed suddenly and unexpectedly from cervical cancer, and I watched as my family came together in a way that was both heartbreaking and immensely uplifting at the same time. The most difficult thing to watch or experience was the loss that incurred when my three cousins lost their mother. I have never seen such raw emotion in my life, and it was heartbreaking. I wanted so desperately to help them, but I was unable to. I had no idea how to speak to these children who had this emotional loss in front of them. I felt incapacitated at the time. So I did what I do well. I made a game. I made a game to let them know how I felt and what I wanted to say. But more than that, I made a game for everyone else who's ever had to talk to somebody going through that loss and felt equally incapacitated as I did. Um, to make this game, I had to look into grief. And there is a common misconception about it that it's an emotion. It is not. It's a process. A process most famously described by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who described the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These 5 stages are often misinterpreted. People believe that these are just the 5 stages you have to do and then you're done. No more grief, back to normal, every day. That is not the case. You are never fully done with grief. While you might accept that your life has permanently changed, that does not say that grief is over. Um, and that is a heartbreaking truth to learn, especially if you want to help people. What I went on to do from here was look into Atletico. I had before me these 3 young boys who were experiencing grief and to an extent unable to talk about it. And what Atletico, the psychiatrist, talks about is the difference between boys and girls in the way that they approach grief. He says that while girls are very open in their experience of grief, they will seek out a support group from their peers and talk about their experiences. Boys have a tendency to be a little bit more introverted about it. They aren't interested in talking about it. It gets too close and becomes too personal. And this led me into making a series of interviews. Firstly, I wanted to talk to somebody who knew more about grief than I do, which led me to Rita Poulsen, a psychologist who deals predominantly with young people going through grief. Secondly, I talked to my cousins. I wanted to get their input. I wanted to actually have a conversation with them about their loss. And thirdly, I visited a boarding school to try out my ideas and see how they would play out. What Rita Poulsen, the psychologist, introduced me to was a duality in grief. The duality goes between introspection and reconstruction. When you're introspective in your grief, you're experiencing the loss by yourself and processing what this means. This is predominantly where the 5 stages of grief occur. When you're constructing, what you're experiencing is the things that make you happy. This could be video games, but it could also be hanging out with friends. What's important here is that you're not bombarded by your grief. You are allowed to reconstruct a life that you had and allowed to have fun and be that person that you would normally be. What can happen if you favor one aspect over the other relative to balancing them is that you may end up suffering from PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a very crippling social anxiety disorder, which actually leaves the patient even worse off than they were when they were grief-stricken. Secondly, I talked to my cousins. I did so in order to break down that wall that I mentioned earlier. What I realized was that these 3 boys had wildly different ways of talking about their mother. The oldest boy was very open about his emotional experience and talked willingly about what loss meant to him. The second brother was open, but less so. Not quite as willing to share the experiences that he were having. The youngest was uninterested in sharing at all. He didn't want to tell his story, and he let his brothers speak from him whenever possible, which was heartbreaking in itself. Lastly, I visited a free-form education boarding school. To my knowledge, none of the kids there had experienced the kind of loss that I was researching. But what I did want to find out was how abstract could I make a story about this for a younger audience? Would they be able to understand what I was trying to say without me explicitly saying it? My expectations were that I needed to be straightforward. I needed to say we're having a conversation about grief and we're gonna talk about it. And the reality became much more abstract, which was a great relief to me. These kids were able to infer from context what I wanted to say and what I wanted to tell them, which creatively became a great gift to me. And from all of this research, Unsafe was born. Unsafe is a game that deals with grief without explicitly telling you that grief has incurred. It deals with what I wanted to say to my teenage cousins at the time. But more than that, it attempts to make a bridge between what people want to say and what people are unable to say. In the game, you play as a young girl who finds herself trapped in her school. And you then have to interact with the environment and interact with these raw emotions to figure out what has happened. This became a metaphor for the experience I was having, being trapped, feeling confined, and ultimately using a tool in my case video games, to express the loss that I had experienced and express what I wanted to say to my teenage cousins. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good day.